The Thanksgiving gathering at Bill Spencer's mansion had been planned down to the smallest detail, a showcase of rebirth, redemption, and the fragile illusion of a family restored. For weeks, the Spencer estate had been alive with preparations, imported wines, a private chef, an orchestra softly rehearsing holiday melodies in the sunroom. Bill wanted perfection, not only for the world to see but for himself, to prove that the chaos of the past years could finally give way to something that resembled peace. It was more than a dinner, it was an announcement. He wanted to show that he was a man reborn, that Katie's forgiveness was within reach, that Will had grown into the kind of son any father would be proud of, and that Electra, bright, eloquent, beautiful, was the new heart of the family, the face of everything the Spencers had survived. The night began with warmth, laughter, and the polished veneer of reconciliation. The long dining table gleamed under the golden chandelier, reflecting faces that, for one rare evening, seemed content. Katie, elegant as ever, arrived with her calm composure and that air of polite distance she always wore when Bill was near. Will looked sharp, though there was an edge to his smile, a boy trying too hard to perform stability in a family that thrived on unspoken fractures. Electra, radiant in a deep burgundy dress, was the embodiment of charm, moving between guests with grace and effortless conversation. She had become, in many ways, the symbol of the Spencers' new era, the muse, the moral anchor, the living proof that the family name could still stand for sophistication rather than scandal. Bill stood at the head of the table, glass in hand, giving one of his famously rehearsed toasts. To family, he said, his voice steady, his smile sincere enough to convince even Katie that perhaps he meant it this time. To second chances, and to gratitude for the people who've made me the man I am tonight. There was applause, soft laughter, and that rare, delicate sensation that for once, everything might just hold together. But perfection, especially in the Spencer world, never lasts. It began quietly. A flicker of lights in the kitchen, barely noticeable under the hum of music and conversation. Then the faint crackle, the smell of something too sharp to be mistaken for roasted turkey. A staff member excused herself to check the oven, and within seconds, the illusion shattered. A scream cut through the laughter. Flames erupted in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the main hall, curling upward with terrifying speed. Someone shouted for water, another for the fire extinguisher, but the heat grew too quickly, feeding on the oil that had spilled across the stove and splattered the curtains. The inferno bloomed like a living creature, devouring air and reason alike. Panic took over. Guests scrambled, knocking over chairs and crystal glassware as smoke poured into the room. Katie's first instinct was will. She scanned the chaos for her son, shouting his name, her voice breaking in the rising roar. Electra tried to help an elderly guest to the door, her delicate features obscured by smoke, her coughs echoing through the confusion. And Bill did what Bill always did. He charged toward the fire, not away from it. "Will's upstairs," he shouted, though no one knew how he could have heard anything above the din. Without hesitation, he pushed through the wall of heat and vanished into the blackness of the staircase. Moments stretched into eternities. The house filled with sirens, neighbors calling emergency lines, alarms blaring, but inside, the sound was muffled by the suffocating crackle of destruction. Katie tried to follow him, but two guests restrained her as smoke consumed the hallway. Every second felt like a betrayal, like time itself was conspiring to erase the people she loved. When the firefighters finally broke through the front door, chaos turned clinical. Orders were shouted, hoses hissed, and flames hissed back in furious resistance. And then, a shout, a figure emerging through the haze. Bill, barely conscious, carrying Will in his arms. His face was ashen, his body trembling from exhaustion and burns. He stumbled onto the front lawn and collapsed as paramedics rushed forward. Will was alive, coughing, frightened, but alive. Bill, however, was motionless, blood trickling from his temple where the beam had struck. But there was no sign of Electra. It wasn't until 10 minutes later that two firefighters carried her out from near the kitchen. Her dress was torn, her body limp. Katie screamed when she saw her, her voice breaking into a sound no human heart could bear. The medics tried resuscitation, but it was futile. Electra Forrester was pronounced dead on the scene, her pulse extinguished long before the fire was out. The world that had seemed so perfectly curated only hours ago collapsed into a tableau of ruin, smoldering ash, twisted beams, and the stench of something chemical beneath the smoke. Katie clung to Will as he sobbed uncontrollably, repeating over and over that it was his fault, though no one understood why. Bill was airlifted to the hospital, unconscious but breathing, his chest caved in from the fallen beam. And Electra's body, once the radiant centerpiece of the evening, was taken away in silence. By dawn, the house was a hollow carcass of charred luxury. Investigators moved methodically through the debris, marking areas of interest, taking samples, photographing every inch. At first, the assumption was simple: a tragic accident, a kitchen fire caused by oil and electricity, the kind of thing that happens even in the most careful homes. But as the morning wore on, whispers began to spread. One of the fire marshals noted an odd smell, too sharp, too chemical to be cooking oil. Near the back door, another found a distinct sheen on the tiles, traces of gasoline. And when they followed the pattern under the debris, it formed a faint but undeniable trail, leading from the back door toward the kitchen, like a fuse waiting for a spark. By noon, the mood had shifted from mourning to suspicion. The house was no longer treated as a scene of tragedy, but as a crime scene. Police sealed off the property, and detectives began asking questions. Who had access to the kitchen? Who had arrived early? Who had lingered near the back door? Why had the fire spread so fast? And why, on Thanksgiving night, had someone chosen to turn celebration into destruction? Katie was questioned first. Her recollection was fragmented. She had been in the dining room when the fire started. She remembered the laughter, the flicker of the lights, the smell of burning oil. She had seen Electra heading toward the kitchen moments before the screams began, offering to help the chef. Could Electra have knocked something over, accidentally caused the fire herself? The thought was unbearable but plausible, at least at first. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The gasoline trail had been poured deliberately, and the fingerprints near the back door didn't belong to any member of the staff. Someone had entered the house before the fire began, someone familiar enough with the layout to avoid being noticed, someone who wanted to make it look like an accident. The investigation widened, pulling in every name associated with the Spencers. Bill, though still unconscious in the hospital, was not spared from suspicion. His history of enemies was long, his reputation for manipulation legendary. But as the detectives dug deeper, darker motives emerged. For one, there was Will. Traumatized, unstable, still haunted by Luna's death and the mysterious messages that had plagued him for months. In the chaos before the fire, he had been seen arguing quietly with Electra in the hallway, his face pale, his hands shaking. No one heard their words, but witnesses recalled tension, a bitterness that seemed misplaced for such a night. When the police later questioned him, Will broke down completely, insisting that he loved Electra, that she had been trying to help him, that she had forgiven him for what happened with Luna. But his tears did little to erase the inconsistencies in his story, why he had gone upstairs just moments before the fire began, and why he claimed not to remember anything until his father found him. Katie, trying to protect her son, found herself caught in the tightening web of investigation. She told detectives that Will had been struggling emotionally, but was incapable of violence. Still, doubts lingered. If not Will, then who? The spotlight turned briefly to Electra herself. As details of her death emerged, rumors began circulating about her life before joining the Spencers. Whispers of debts, jealous rivals, and secrets buried in the world of design and high society. A small but growing faction believed the fire might not have been aimed at Bill at all, but at her. Someone with a score to settle. But the presence of gasoline, the deliberate planning, suggested something larger, a vendetta rather than a personal feud. Meanwhile, Bill hovered between life and death, unconscious, but occasionally muttering incoherently. Nurses reported hearing him say names in his sleep: Katie's, Will's, Electra's, and once, disturbingly, Luna's. The mention of Luna reopened wounds that the family had barely managed to close. Could this fire somehow be connected to her mysterious death months before? Was someone targeting the Spencers because of what happened that night on the beach? Katie couldn't shake the feeling that everything was linked: the fire, the messages, Luna's disappearance, the guilt that had consumed her son. She began her own quiet investigation, piecing together what the police missed. She retraced the timeline of the party, the guest list, even the staff roster. One detail caught her attention: a last-minute delivery that had arrived hours before the dinner, a crate of fine wine, supposedly sent by a business associate of Bill's. No one had checked its contents before it was stored in the kitchen. When the remains of that crate were examined, traces of accelerant were found inside. Whoever planned the fire had prepared it in advance. The revelation brought no comfort, only more fear. Someone had targeted them deliberately, someone who knew their habits, their weaknesses, their desire to put on a perfect front. The fire hadn't just been meant to destroy property, it had been meant to destroy the illusion of the Spencer family itself. Weeks passed, and the public narrative began to spin out of control. The media painted the story as a Shakespearean tragedy: the patriarch nearly killed in a blaze, the son traumatized, the family muse lost to flames. Speculation fed on itself. Was it corporate sabotage? Revenge from an old rival? A domestic betrayal? Bill, once awake, faced the press with the same defiance that had built his empire, insisting it was an accident, refusing to admit vulnerability. But his body betrayed him, his hands trembled, his voice cracked. He couldn't hide the fear that for once, he wasn't the one in control. Katie, though outwardly composed, carried a storm inside her. Every night, she replayed the fire in her mind, the heat, the screams, the look on Electra's face the last time she saw her alive. And every night, she asked herself the same question: what kind of hatred burns this deliberately? In the months that followed, new evidence surfaced. Fragments of surveillance footage showing a figure near the back gate hours before the fire. The image was blurry, but the posture was eerily familiar. Will, seeing it, turned white. He insisted it wasn't him, but his reaction convinced no one. Katie defended him fiercely, but in private, she began to doubt. The final twist came when investigators found a second trail of accelerant, this one leading not from the back door but from the side entrance near the guest quarters, where Electra had been seen heading before the fire. Suddenly, the theory shifted again. Could she have discovered the intruder and been silenced before she could warn anyone? Or, more hauntingly, had she been part of the plan all along, caught in a game that spiraled beyond her control? By the end of the investigation, one truth remained clear: the fire was not an accident. It was a message. And though the sender remained in the shadows, the meaning was unmistakable: some sins refused to stay buried. The night that was meant to redeem the Spencers had instead exposed their deepest fractures. The mansion would be rebuilt, as Spencer properties always were, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would linger. Bill would survive, but never fully recover. Katie would live with questions that had no answers. And Will, haunted by the memory of two women lost to fire and guilt, would forever wonder if redemption was ever possible for a man born into so much ruin. In the smoldering silence after the flames, the Spencer family stood at the crossroads between truth and survival once again. And as the ashes cooled, it became clear that Thanksgiving at the Spencer estate had not been a rebirth. It had been the reckoning that fate had promised all along. The fire at the Spencer estate had been declared an accident within hours of the flames being extinguished. A tragedy, yes, but a domestic one. A cruel twist of fate that snatched beauty from the world and left grief in its place. That was the story the press was told, the one they printed beneath glossy photos of Electra Forrester, radiant in life and perfect in death. But behind the polished tributes and the carefully worded statements, the air inside the Spencer household was thick with a different kind of smoke, one that no fire department could clear. It wasn't long before the investigation took an unexpected turn. shifting away from faulty wiring and kitchen oil to something far darker. The focus was no longer on Bill, nor on negligence. It was on Electra herself, the girl who had been loved, envied, and ultimately consumed by secrets she thought she had buried. 2 days before the fire, the staff had noticed something unusual, a cream-colored envelope placed on the console table in the Spencer living room. There was no postage, no return address, only Electra's name written in looping cursive with a pen that bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. She had picked it up without a word, excused herself to her room, and when she came down an hour later, her face was drained of color. No one asked what it contained. No one dared. But that night, when she thought she was alone, one of the maids overheard her murmuring to herself, "I told you it was gone, you can't still have it." The next morning, she pretended nothing had happened, laughing a little too brightly, complimenting Katie's dress, fussing over the Thanksgiving menu as if she were determined to smother some invisible dread beneath layers of politeness. The envelope, as the police would later discover, contained a single photograph, creased, sun-faded, its edges frayed. It was taken decades ago, somewhere in the south of France. A younger Electra stood at the center of a group of people in their 20s, champagne flutes in hand, the Mediterranean glittering behind them. She was smiling, but not her usual radiant smile. It was a strained, uncertain one, the kind of smile someone wears when a camera turns on at the wrong moment. On the back of the photo was a single sentence scrawled in thick black ink: "Fire is the best way to erase a stain." The words were simple, but their meaning was unmistakable. Whoever sent the message wasn't threatening random violence. They were reminding her of something that had already happened once before. When the arson investigators returned to the Spencer house, the evidence they found told a story very different from the one Bill's lawyers wanted them to believe. Beneath the charred remains of the kitchen cabinets, they discovered melted plastic fragments and distorted metal coils, the remains of a small timer mechanism. Not an industrial one, but the kind used in travel gadgets, or in theatrical pyrotechnics. There were traces of accelerant near the rear entrance, consistent with gasoline or ethanol, but in quantities too precise for accident. The fire had not spread randomly. It had been engineered, to start and grow quickly, consuming oxygen until it reached the main living area. At first, suspicion naturally fell on Bill, as it always did when misfortune brushed against his empire. But the longer detectives studied the evidence, the clearer it became that this wasn't about him. Every trace, every piece of timing, every detail led back to Electra, her movements, her choices, her history. What kind of woman received a death threat and kept it secret? What kind of woman walked straight into a fire she might have known was coming? The truth, of course, was buried under years of reinvention. Electra Forrester was not just a muse, nor the golden girl of the fashion world. Before Los Angeles, before her luminous appearances at Forrester Creations and her perfectly curated life beside Will Spencer, she had been someone else entirely. In Europe, she had lived fast, loved recklessly, and been at the center of a scandal so severe it had nearly ended her career before it began. Those who knew whispered about a summer in Milan that went wrong, a designer's death, a missing collection, an accusation that disappeared as quickly as it surfaced. The official story was vague, a tragic accident during a photo shoot in a coastal villa. But those who had been there remembered the flames, the rumors of sabotage, and a young model who left the country the next morning under a different name. The parallels between that night in Italy and the fire at Bill's mansion were too sharp to ignore. The phrase in the letter, "Fire is the best way to erase a stain," wasn't poetic, it was literal. The first scandal had been silenced by flames, and now, decades later, someone wanted history to repeat itself. Katie found herself drawn into the mystery despite her better judgment. She had never fully trusted Electra. Something about her effortless grace felt too practiced, her warmth too calculated, but she had grown to respect the woman's influence on Will. Electra had steadied him after Luna's death, given him something to focus on, someone to protect. To lose her now, and in such violent fashion, had ripped open old wounds that were barely healing. When the police showed Katie the photograph from the envelope, she felt a chill crawl down her spine. It wasn't just Electra in that picture. Standing behind her, partially obscured, was a man Katie recognized. He had attended one of Bill's charity galas months earlier, a venture capitalist named Adrian Marchand, known for his luxurious lifestyle and his rumored connection to the European art underworld. He had vanished from public view years ago after being linked to a fraud investigation in Monaco. Adrian's presence in the photograph changed everything. It meant that Electra's past had not only caught up with her, it had walked straight through her front door. Detectives pieced together fragments of her final weeks, each one more unsettling than the last. Electra's assistant recalled that her schedule had changed abruptly. Late-night meetings she refused to explain, unexplained withdrawals from her personal accounts, and a visit to a law firm specializing in international contracts. She had also purchased a life insurance policy 3 weeks before her death, worth millions, naming Will as the sole beneficiary. When asked about it, Will was too distraught to respond coherently. He said she wanted him to be safe if anything happened, but he hadn't understood what she meant. The insurance alone might have been dismissed as precaution, but combined with the other clues, the envelope, the accelerant, the timer, it painted a disturbing picture. The fire had been staged to look like an accident, but the intended victim was never Bill, never the family. It was Electra. Someone wanted her silenced permanently, and they had ensured her death would be masked as a domestic tragedy. The question was why. Katie began her own investigation, quietly, driven not by loyalty to Electra, but by the need to protect Will. The last thing her son needed was to be dragged into another scandal, another storm of grief and suspicion. She combed through Electra's old interviews, charity records, even her passport history. That's when she found the connection no one else had seen. 6 months earlier, Electra had taken a trip to France, citing a brand collaboration. The same week, Adrian Marchand was photographed at a private art exhibit in Nice, the first public sighting of him in years. 3 days later, a small gallery in Monaco burned to the ground, destroying millions in art, all of it insured under a shell company tied to Adrian. The local authorities ruled it arson. And yet, the only casualty was a woman whose body was burned beyond recognition, a woman who, witnesses said, matched Electra's height and build. Katie's blood ran cold as she pieced it together. If Electra had been there, if she had been involved in the fire in Monaco, then she had already faked her death once. But who had died in her place? And why had she returned to Los Angeles, where someone clearly wanted her gone for good? When the detectives interviewed Bill in his hospital bed, he could offer little. He had admired Electra, yes, perhaps even loved her in the complicated way powerful men love women who challenge their control. But he hadn't known about her past, nor about the envelope. She kept her secrets like art pieces, he said, voice hoarse from smoke and medication. Beautiful, framed, and untouchable. When asked if anyone had access to the house that night who shouldn't have, he hesitated. There was a delivery, he said finally. A floral arrangement. It came late. She signed for it herself. The delivery company, when traced, did not exist. As investigators followed that lead, a chilling pattern emerged. The bouquet Electra had received was not decorative, it was symbolic. Hidden among the white roses were sprigs of lavender and stalks of burnt sage, flowers traditionally used in France to mark mourning and erasure. Whoever sent them wasn't expressing affection. They were sending a message: it's time. Electra's final hours, reconstructed through phone records and security footage, revealed that she had made several unanswered calls that evening to a number registered in Switzerland. The line was encrypted, and tracing it proved nearly impossible. But fragments of the audio recovered from her voicemail hinted at panic. "You said it was over," she had whispered in one message. "You said I was safe." The police concluded that Electra's death was a deliberate act, disguised as a family accident. Yet no one could prove who lit the fire, who stood in the shadows and watched as the house erupted in flames. The envelope, the timer, the flowers, all of it pointed towards someone who knew her intimately, someone who understood her fears and her guilt. The truth unraveled in fragments, through whispers and leaked reports, until the final piece came from an unexpected source, a private investigator hired by one of Electra's European associates. He uncovered documents proving that Electra had been blackmailing Adrian Marchand. The evidence she held, photos, financial records, and a confession letter, could have destroyed him. But Electra's plan had gone wrong. She had underestimated the kind of man Adrian truly was. He hadn't just wanted his reputation protected, he wanted her erased completely. In the end, it wasn't greed or jealousy that killed Electra. It was history. The fire that consumed her had been set long before she ever stepped into the Spencer mansion. It had been smoldering for years, waiting for the right night, the right excuse, the right spark. When the investigation finally closed, the official statement read like a eulogy. No charges filed. Evidence inconclusive. Accidental ignition, likely caused by electrical malfunction. It was a lie everyone agreed to believe, because the truth was too corrosive, too dangerous, too connected to people who preferred the past remain ash. But Katie never forgot the photograph, or the faint smell of lavender on the ashes that clung to her coat when she left the morgue. She knew what the fire had really been, a cover story written in flame, a message to anyone who thought they could outrun their sins. And somewhere, across the Atlantic, in a glass tower overlooking the Côte d'Azur, a man raised a glass of wine and stared at the front-page article announcing Electra's death. He smiled, not with triumph, but with recognition. Because in the end, Electra hadn't been a victim of chance. She had been the final witness to a story that was never supposed to be told, and the fire, as always, had done what it was meant to do. It had erased her, but not completely. For as long as the Spencers lived with her ghost, as long as Will dreamed of her laughter, and as long as Katie kept that faded photograph locked in her drawer, the truth would flicker like a dying flame, refusing, against all odds, to go out.